An elderly woman in a wheelchair sat silently at the edge of the vast plains, her eyes searching the endless horizon. Suddenly, a majestic wild Mustang emerged from the distance, its movements both graceful and cautious. As the horse approached, something extraordinary happened. An unspoken connection formed between them. What could a free, untamed creature possibly want with someone confined to a wheelchair? This remarkable moment would set off a chain of events that no one could have foreseen, weaving a tale of resilience, hope, and the extraordinary power of an unbreakable bond. Margaret Peterson had spent decades living on the outskirts of the plains. Her quaint home, filled with memories, was a testament to her former life as an accomplished equestrian. Once a skilled rider, Margaret had graced the arenas with her elegance and skill. But all of that changed 20 years ago when a car accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. Now at 78, her connection with horses was limited to watching the wild Mustangs roam the plains from her porch. Her days were predictable, with weekly visits from her granddaughter Emma, who brought groceries and companionship. Yet, most of Margaret's time was spent alone, gazing wistfully at the endless plains that stretched beyond her backyard, a constant reminder of the freedom she once had and the untamed beauty that still thrived. One crisp morning, Margaret wheeled herself outside to enjoy the soft warmth of the sun. As she settled into her usual spot, something caught her eye. At the edge of her property stood a lone Mustang. Unlike the others, which usually stayed far from human dwellings, this one was uncharacteristically close. Its dark, glossy coat shimmered under the sunlight, and its sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to lock onto hers. For a moment, Margaret froze. Wild Mustangs rarely approached humans, yet this one stood unmoving, its gaze fixed on her. Slowly, it stepped closer, its hooves crunching softly against the dry grass. Margaret's heartbeat quickened as she clutched the arms of her wheelchair. The Mustang stopped just 20 feet away, its posture both curious and cautious. "What are you doing here?" Margaret murmured, her voice trembling. The horse flicked its ears, almost as if it understood her words. Watching the creature, so free and full of life, filled Margaret with a bittersweet ache. The Mustang embodied everything she had lost: freedom, strength, and the ability to run without restraint. The moment was fleeting. Without warning, the Mustang turned and bolted, disappearing over the hill as swiftly as it had come. Margaret sat there, her hands trembling on the armrests of her chair. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever: wonder. Later that day, when Emma arrived, Margaret eagerly recounted the encounter. "A wild horse came up to me," she said, her voice filled with awe. Emma chuckled softly, brushing it off as one of her grandmother's vivid imaginings. "Maybe it was just a dream, Grandma." But Margaret knew better. That Mustang had come to her for a reason, and deep in her heart, she felt their story was far from over. The next morning, Margaret wheeled herself out to her usual spot, her eyes scanning the horizon with a quiet hope. The sun rose higher, casting a warm orange glow over the plains. Hours passed, and the day unfolded in its usual stillness. Just as Margaret was about to head back inside, the faint sound of hooves reached her ears. Her breath caught. There it was, the same Mustang from the day before. It approached slowly, its movements deliberate yet unthreatening. Margaret's heart pounded as she watched the creature come even closer, stopping mere feet from her porch. She extended her trembling hand instinctively. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice soft and inviting. The Mustang flared its nostrils, taking in her scent. It didn't bolt this time, instead lingering nearby, grazing while keeping Margaret in its peripheral vision. For Margaret, the moment was transformative. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as a frail old woman in a wheelchair, but as someone deserving of attention and connection. As the days turned into weeks, the Mustang became a familiar presence, visiting Margaret almost daily. Each time, it came closer, and Margaret began leaving small buckets of water near the porch. She nicknamed the horse Shadow, after its sleek, dark coat that seemed to meld with the dusk. Emma remained skeptical despite Margaret's insistence. "Wild horses don't just walk up to people, Grandma," she said, shaking her head. "Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Margaret smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the wild recognizes the broken, Emma. Maybe it sees something in me that others can't." But not everyone viewed Shadow's presence with the same reverence. Tom, a local rancher, had spotted the horse near his cattle. "That Mustang's trouble," he warned Margaret one afternoon. "They spook the herds, and if it keeps hanging around here, someone's bound to go after it." Margaret's chest tightened. She was painfully aware of the dangers wild mustangs faced, being captured, or worse, killed for venturing too close to human territory. The thought of losing this unexpected connection filled her with dread. That evening, Margaret sat quietly on her porch, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Shadow appeared once more, venturing closer than ever. As she looked into the horse's deep, intelligent eyes, she felt a fierce resolve take root within her. If the world was against Shadow, she would do everything in her power to protect him, even if it meant going against the very community she had lived in for decades. Each morning, Margaret waited for Shadow's visits, her heart lifting at the sight of the dark figure against the golden plains. Their bond deepened, and Shadow's cautious nature began to soften. Margaret spoke to him in the tender voice she once used with her beloved horses, finding in him a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. "Good morning, Shadow," she greeted one sunny afternoon, holding out a carrot with her wrinkled hand. Shadow hesitated, his ears flicking back and forth. Then, with deliberate caution, he stepped forward, his soft lips brushing against her palm. Margaret's laughter rang out, unrestrained and pure, echoing across the plains. For the first time in decades, she felt the warmth of unbridled joy. Shadow grazed nearby, his presence a soothing balm to her long lonely heart. Word of their unlikely bond spread through the small town. Curious neighbors stopped by, marveling at the connection between Margaret and the wild mustang. Some, like Tom, remained wary. "That animal doesn't belong here," Tom said one afternoon, his tone firm. "Wild horses need to stay in the wild. You're just encouraging him to stick around, and that's not good for anyone." Margaret met his gaze, her own steady and unyielding. "He's not causing harm, Tom. He's just lost, like so many of us are." But deep down, Margaret knew the risks. Despite Tom's warnings, Margaret's connection with Shadow only deepened. She set up a small area near her porch, leaving hay and fresh water for the mustang. Day by day, Shadow's trust grew, and soon he allowed Margaret to stroke his sleek neck. Her frail fingers traced the contours of his muscles, each touch grounding her in the moment. These interactions became her lifeline, a source of comfort and purpose. In Shadow, Margaret saw a mirror of her own spirit, wild, resilient, and yearning for freedom. But the peace they had found together was short-lived. One afternoon, as Shadow grazed near the house, the rumble of an engine disrupted the stillness. Margaret's heart sank as Tom's truck pulled into her driveway. He stepped out, his hat in hand, his face etched with concern. "Margaret," he began, his tone firm but not unkind, "I warned you. That horse has been spotted near my cattle again. If it causes trouble, the authorities won't hesitate to take action. And this time, I can't stop them." Margaret's voice wavered, but her determination was unshaken. "Shadow's not causing harm, Tom. He's just trying to survive, like all of us." Tom sighed, shaking his head. "You can't save every wild thing, Margaret. Sometimes, nature has to take its course." That night, Margaret sat on her porch, gazing at the dark horizon. Shadow's silhouette appeared under the moonlight, his form strong yet solitary. As Margaret watched him, a tear slipped down her cheek. For the first time in years, she had found something worth fighting for, a bond that transcended words and reason. A week later, the tranquil plains were interrupted by a storm brewing on the horizon. The air grew heavy, carrying the ominous scent of rain. Margaret wheeled herself to the porch, her hands gripping the armrests as she scanned the sky. Shadow hadn't visited that day, and unease coiled in her stomach as the first raindrops fell. By nightfall, the storm was in full force. Winds howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the windows. Margaret couldn't sleep, her mind consumed with worry for Shadow. Was he braving the storm alone? Had he found shelter? The questions gnawed at her as the hours dragged on. When dawn finally broke, the storm subsided, leaving the plains soaked and shimmering. Margaret hurried outside, her eyes searching the landscape. Relief and heartbreak collided when she spotted Shadow in the distance. The Mustang was limping, his dark coat caked with mud and water. His usually graceful movements were reduced to a painful shuffle. Margaret called out to him, her voice trembling, "Shadow, come here." Shadow's ears twitched at her voice. Despite his injury, he hobbled toward her, each step an evident struggle. When he reached the porch, Margaret saw the source of his pain, a deep gash on his front leg, likely caused by debris scattered during the storm. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she wheeled herself closer. "Oh, Shadow," she whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. "You're hurt." She knew tending to a wild horse's injury was no small feat, but she couldn't leave him in pain. Slowly, she extended her hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. Shadow flinched but didn't pull away. Encouraged by his trust, Margaret retrieved a clean towel and antiseptic from the house. Her movements were careful, her voice steady as she cleaned the wound. Shadow stood still, his sharp eyes watching her intently. Margaret marveled at his resilience, at the fragile yet powerful bond that allowed him to trust her in this vulnerable moment. The news of Shadow's injury spread quickly through the small town. While some neighbors expressed concern, others, like Tom, saw it as proof of the Mustang's disruptive presence. "You can't keep nursing that horse, Margaret," Tom said one afternoon, his tone a mix of frustration and pity. "The county's been hearing complaints about a wild Mustang near human properties. They're sending a team out next week to round him up." The words hit Margaret like a blow. "Round him up? You mean take him to one of those holding facilities?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tom sighed, his expression softening. "It's for the best. Wild horses can't stay near people. It's dangerous for them and for us." Margaret's grip on her wheelchair tightened. "He's not dangerous, Tom. He's just lost, like so many of us." But deep down, she knew the odds were against her. Mustangs captured by authorities were often sent to overcrowded holding pens, their futures uncertain at best and grim at worst. The thought of Shadow losing his freedom was unbearable. That evening, Margaret sat in the fading light, her gaze fixed on the plains. Shadow appeared, his strong, graceful form silhouetted against the sunset. Her heart ached at the thought of losing him, but what could she, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, possibly do to protect him? The answer came from an unexpected source. The following day, Emma arrived for her weekly visit, and Margaret wasted no time sharing the news about the planned roundup. To Margaret's surprise, Emma didn't dismiss her concerns or chalk them up to wistful imagination. Instead, she listened with intent, her brows furrowed in thought. "What if we moved him somewhere safer?" Emma suggested. "There's that wildlife sanctuary a few towns over. They have land specifically set aside for Mustangs. It's not the wild, but it's a lot better than a holding pen." Margaret's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Do you think they'd take him?" "I can call and find out," Emma replied, already pulling out her phone. The sanctuary's response was encouraging. They agreed to take Shadow, provided he could be safely transported. But the logistics of such a move were daunting. Catching and moving a wild horse was no easy task, and Margaret knew that Shadow wouldn't trust anyone else the way he trusted her. The days that followed were a flurry of activity. Emma arranged for a horse trailer and enlisted the help of a local veterinarian to ensure Shadow's safety during the journey. Margaret, in turn, spent as much time as possible with Shadow, preparing him for what was to come. She spoke to him softly every day, explaining the situation in soothing tones, even though she wasn't certain he could understand her words. When the day of the move arrived, the air was thick with anticipation. The veterinarian, Emma, and a small group of helpers worked carefully, trying to guide Shadow toward the trailer. Margaret remained nearby, her presence a calming force. Shadow was visibly uneasy. His ears flicked back and forth, and he stomped the ground with nervous energy. "It's okay, boy," Margaret called out, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "You're going to a place where you'll be safe. I promise." Shadow turned his gaze toward Margaret, his dark eyes reflecting a mix of trust and apprehension. With deliberate slowness, he stepped into the trailer. The door closed with a heavy thud, and Margaret felt a pang of guilt twist in her chest. Though she knew this was the right decision, the sight of Shadow confined within the trailer was almost too much to bear. As the vehicle pulled away, Margaret sat silently on her porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The plains stretched out before her, now quiet and empty. A single tear slid down her cheek. She had fought to save Shadow, but the cost of their parting was heavier than she had anticipated. Emma called later that evening to reassure her. "Grandma, Shadow's going to be fine," she said, her voice bright with optimism. "The sanctuary is beautiful, rolling hills, open pastures, and plenty of room to roam. He'll be happy there. Margaret nodded, though Emma couldn't see her through the phone. I know it's the right thing, she murmured, her voice soft and reflective. But that doesn't make it any easier. The nights that followed were restless. Margaret lay awake, her thoughts consumed by the image of Shadow stepping into the trailer, his trust palpable yet tinged with uncertainty. She wondered if he felt abandoned, if he would forgive her for sending him away. A week later, Emma arrived with unexpected news. The sanctuary invited us to visit, she said, her smile wide. They want you to see how he's doing. Margaret's heart leapt at the prospect. The thought of seeing Shadow again filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in days. When can we go? She asked eagerly. The trip was arranged for the following weekend. Emma helped Margaret into the car, carefully loading her wheelchair into the trunk. As they drove, Margaret stared out at the passing landscapes, her thoughts filled with Shadow. Would he remember her? Would he still trust her after everything? The sanctuary was nestled in a tranquil valley surrounded by rolling hills. As the car turned onto the gravel driveway, Margaret's breath caught. Open pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, filled with grazing mustangs. The sight was breathtaking. A staff member greeted them warmly and led them toward Shadow's enclosure. Margaret's hands trembled as they approached, her anticipation mounting with each step. Then she saw him. Shadow stood near the edge of the fence, his dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. He was no longer limping, and his stance had regained the proud, confident air of a leader. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she wheeled closer. Shadow, she called softly. The Mustang's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He turned his head, standing still for a moment as though processing the familiarity of her tone. Then, to everyone's amazement, he began walking toward her. His steps were measured but purposeful, each one closing the gap between them. Margaret extended her hand, her heart pounding. Shadow lowered his head, his soft muzzle brushing against her palm. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "You remember me?" The sanctuary staff watched in awe. "He's thriving here," one of them said. "But it's clear you two share something special." Margaret spent hours with Shadow that day, speaking to him in the same tender voice she always had. She stroked his neck, feeling the strength of the creature she had fought so hard to protect. When it was time to leave, Margaret's heart ached, but it was different now. She knew Shadow was safe, free to live as he was meant to. As she said her goodbyes, she whispered, "Be happy, Shadow. You'll always have a piece of my heart." As they drove home, the car was filled with a peaceful silence. Margaret gazed out at the horizon, a quiet smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. The days that followed were brighter, infused with a quiet joy that Margaret hadn't felt in years. Each morning, she wheeled herself onto the porch, no longer waiting for Shadow to appear, but simply appreciating the beauty of the plains. The endless horizon, the golden sunlight, and the gentle rustle of the wind all felt more vivid now, as if Shadow had left a piece of his free spirit behind. Margaret began documenting her experiences in a journal, her memories of Shadow flowing freely onto the pages. She wrote about the day he first approached her, the bond they had formed, and the way he had reignited her sense of purpose. "Shadow taught me," she wrote, "that freedom isn't about where you are, but how you choose to live." Word of Margaret's bond with Shadow spread throughout the small town, drawing neighbors who had once dismissed her stories. They stopped by her house to ask questions, their skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Even Tom, the gruff rancher who had warned her about Shadow, paid her a visit one breezy afternoon. "I heard you got that Mustang into a sanctuary," Tom said, tipping his hat as he stood on her porch. His tone was gruff, but his words carried a hint of admiration. "Guess I was wrong about you too. Took guts to do what you did." Margaret smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mix of pride and gratitude. "He taught me more about courage than I ever could have taught him," she replied. Emma, inspired by her grandmother's journey, began volunteering at the sanctuary on weekends. Each visit brought back stories of Shadow's new life. "They say he's a leader," Emma told Margaret one evening. "Whenever they open a new pasture, he's the first to explore, and the others follow him. It's like he knows he's free." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She had always known Shadow was special, and hearing about his thriving life at the sanctuary filled her with contentment. One day, Emma suggested hosting a fundraiser to support the sanctuary. "We could do it right here in the backyard," she proposed. "You could share your story about Shadow. People would love to hear it." Margaret agreed, eager to contribute to the place that had given Shadow a new lease on life. The fundraiser was held on a crisp autumn evening, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. Neighbors, friends, and even some sanctuary staff attended, their faces alight with anticipation. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, her journal resting on her lap. She looked out at the familiar faces, her voice steady as she began to speak. "For years, I felt trapped by my circumstances, my body, and my own mind. Then, one day, a wild Mustang came into my life. Shadow reminded me that freedom isn't just about where you are, it's about how you choose to see the world and live within it." Her words resonated deeply, moving many in the crowd to tears. By the end of the evening, they had raised enough funds to support several more Mustangs at the sanctuary. Margaret felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that Shadow's story was inspiring change far beyond her own life. As the seasons changed, Margaret's connection with Shadow remained strong. Emma often took her to visit the sanctuary, where Shadow would greet her with the same gentle nuzzle. Each visit reaffirmed the unspoken bond between them, a bond that transcended species and circumstances, rooted in mutual trust and understanding. On one such visit, Margaret watched Shadow lead his herd across the rolling hills. His powerful stride and commanding presence reminded her of the day he had first approached her, hesitant but curious. Now, he moved with confidence, a testament to his resilience and the freedom he had reclaimed. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret sat on her porch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The plains stretched out before her, bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun. She thought about Shadow, running free in the sanctuary's vast pastures, his spirit unbroken and his strength unwavering. A smile spread across her face as she whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Shadow, for reminding me what it means to truly live." Margaret's life had been forever changed by a wild Mustang. Though their time together had been brief, the lessons he had imparted would echo in her heart for the rest of her days. Margaret and Shadow's story became a testament to the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and animals. Their connection wasn't just about survival, it was about finding hope, healing, and courage in the face of life's challenges. Shadow's journey to safety and freedom mirrored Margaret's own rediscovery of purpose and resilience. If this story touched your heart, remember that every small act of kindness can create a ripple of change. Let Margaret and Shadow's story inspire you to see the beauty and connections around you, no matter how unexpected they may be. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves stories of hope and courage. Together, we can continue sharing these inspiring tales that remind us of the extraordinary power of compassion.